Okay, let's unpack this a bit. Imagine a whole continent, rich in resources, young, dynamic, deciding it's time to set its own course. What actually happens when it starts unifying? It's this big dream of one passport, one currency, one government. So today, we're taking a deep dive into that exact vision, the emerging One Africa government, and also how the West is reacting, and a really key recent event, that surprising peace deal between the DRC and Rwanda. Our goal here is to pull out the most important bits from the sources you've shared, connect the dots on this, rapidly unfolding story.
Yeah, and what's really striking, I think, is that this isn't just some abstract concept anymore. Our sources are pretty clear. It's becoming a continental reality that's actually in motion. And the implications, they're huge, not just for Africa, obviously, but for global politics, economics, everything. We've got quite a mix of material articles, some deep research, insightful notes, all giving different perspectives on this really complex situation.
Okay, so let's start with the core vision itself, this One Africa government. Its roots go way back, right? Pan-Africanism, that really audacious dream, one passport, one currency, one government, for over 1.5 billion people. And like you said, it's not just a dream now. The sources call it a continental reality in motion. Whispers, maybe more than whispers now, in the halls of Addis Ababa under the AU's golden ceiling. The big shift seems to be Africa moving from just, exporting raw stuff.
Right, raw mineral.
To exporting its own decisions, making its own calls, not bowing to outside powers anymore.
And digging into that a bit more, the sources suggest something interesting. When Africa really decides to think for itself, it creates, the word used is panic, among certain established powers.
Panic. Okay, that's strong. Why panic specifically?
It seems directly tied to the resources. We're talking vast wealth. Gold, cobalt, oil, a continent that rich deciding its own terms. That fundamentally shakes up existing power structures,
Yeah.
Global supply chains.
Right. But the sources also expect pushback, don't they? Our notes lay out these 5 potential strategic moves from the West. They're even called war tactics, but without the bombs and missiles. Because, quote, Western powers will not sit back while Africa organizes itself. Makes sense. So first up, economic pressure. Things like freezing AU central funds, maybe delaying World Bank loans.
Or even restrictions on new African digital currencies.
Exactly. Then number 2, divide and rule, basically amplifying existing tensions.
Border issues, election disputes.
Yeah, ethnic clashes, making them seem worse, maybe subtly intensified to stop that unity. Third is media warfare, flooding the zone with negative stories.
Like Africa's not ready, or a single government means dictatorship.
Or that it's too risky for investors. Classic fear-mongering.
Right.
Fourth, buying out leaders, targeting maybe more fragile heads of state with big billion-dollar development packages.
Just sort of quietly pull them away from the AU unity discussions.
Seems plausible. And finally, number 5, weaponizing security, offering military help, NATO or UN maybe.
But using it to secretly monitor or even sabotage African-led command structures. What's really insidious about these tactics, as the sources point out, is how they use existing problems. They don't need brute force. It's more subtle, designed to make internal issues look like, just internal failures, not outside meddling.
Do the sources give any hints about which powers might be most concerned? Or why they'd panic instead of, say, trying to cooperate strategically?
That's a good point. They don't really name names specifically, but the implication is any major power that relies heavily on African resources or, its current influence, they'd naturally feel threatened by a unified Africa setting its own rules.
Okay. So less about one specific enemy, more about a potential shift in the whole global balance.
Exactly.
A systemic shift.
Okay, now let's pivot to something concrete. This recent DRC-Rwanda situation, Eastern Congo. Tragically, it's often been called a chessboard for foreign powers.
Yeah.
Right? Using local fighters, all about the minerals.
A heartbreaking situation for years. But then, something big happened. June 27th, 2025. The foreign ministers, they're Kaiko Wagner from DRC, Olivier Dunguier from Rwanda, they signed a peace deal in Washington, D.C., brokered by the U.S.
And the name itself is telling.
Right. The Critical Minerals for Security and Peace Deal. On the surface, the terms look good. End the conflict, disarm rebels, secure borders. Rwanda withdraws troops in 90 days.
Standard peace deal language.
But yeah, the sources highlight the underlying driver, those critical minerals, cobalt, lithium, coltan. Essential for Western tech empires. President Trump brokered it, called it a wonderful treaty. Presidents Tshisekedi and Kagame are set to visit the White House to sign the formal Washington Accord.
And Qatar was involved too, as a quiet broker.
Yeah, interesting side note there, a quiet power broker.
So this deal, it really crystallizes the tension, doesn't it? On one hand, it is a peace deal, potentially ending decades of suffering. That's huge. But on the other hand, it clearly serves a massive interest in critical minerals. So the big question hanging over it, according to our sources, is this primarily about peace for Africa?
Or is it about access for the West?
Exactly, that's the crux of it. Stated goals versus, well, economic realities.
So how does this tie back to the whole One Africa government idea? This is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Our sources flag a crucial detail. President Trump didn't just invite the leaders of DRC and Rwanda.
Yeah.
He also invited the African Union chairperson, João Lourenço, who's also the president of Angola, to Washington.
Ah, now that is significant.
The sources say that's huge. It put the AU front and center. Symbolically, that changes the narrative, doesn't it? From West versus Africa to maybe West plus AU versus chaos.
So the AU wasn't sidelined, it was actually seated at the same table. That's a fascinating angle, because it suggests this particular initiative. Maybe it wasn't designed to undermine the AU, at least not overtly. Sure, it was negotiated outside Addis Ababa, but bringing João Lourenço to the Oval Office, that's a nod to continental representation. And it could, potentially, shift power away from just isolated deals between individual countries and the West, towards more joint diplomacy.
Right.
Which could actually make it harder to divide Africa if
the AU leaders really step up and use that position.
Precisely. The sources even say the Washington Accords framework actually preserves AU relevance rather than diminishes it. That's a subtle but important point.
Okay, so given all these challenges, these external pressures, is Africa just stuck? Not according to our sources. They say Africa is fighting back, but intelligently. And there are concrete steps happening towards unity. It's not just talk. First, this Pan-African Constitution. Apparently, it's a near-complete document.
Wow, ready.
Yeah, laying the legal groundwork for unified governance, leadership rotation, digital ID, sharing resources.
Okay, what else?
Then, these Afro-ruled currency trials, Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, they're secretly piloting a digital currency.
Afro-ruled, backed by gold.
Yep, a gold-backed digital currency, Afro-ruled for trade across borders. That's a big move towards financial independence.
Absolutely, away from traditional systems.
And security. Plans for a single African military command under the AU's Peace and Security Council. They're already in phase 2.
So legal, economic, security.
And people power. There's huge youth political mobilization. Pan-African Gen Z, they call it.
On TikTok, YouTube, campuses.
Exactly. Pushing hard for integration. And finally, African tech giants are getting on board.
How so?
Fintech, telecoms, aligning their products for the future. Cross-border payments, ID verification, things like that.
So it's a multi-pronged approach.
Yeah. The sources emphasize this is not the Africa of 1960.
That multifaceted strategy is clear. Legal, economic, security, tech.
Yeah.
It's comprehensive self-empowerment. But it does make you wonder, host, do the sources mention any internal hurdles? I mean, unifying 50-plus countries. There must be disagreements, right? Dissenting voices within Africa itself.
That's a fair point. And yeah, while the sources focus on the drive for unity, they don't pretend it's easy.
Yeah.
They implicitly acknowledge those internal complexities, different economic levels, local political interest, historical issues.
Sure.
But the overall narrative presented is that the momentum toward unity is the dominant trend, even with those challenges.
Right.
It's not depicted as monolithic, but as a powerful current. And, no government plan works without the people. That's a key message, too. Ordinary Africans are being urged to get involved.
How? What are they supposed to do?
Speak up on social media, in their communities, even on the streets. Support the One Africa vision actively and critically question deals. If their president signs something with the West, ask, how does this fit with AU policy, with our united vision?
Holding leaders accountable to the bigger picture.
Exactly. Also, support Pan-African media, SABBN is mentioned, like an independent news network for the continent. The megaphone of the revolution, call it.
Interesting.
And finally, push leaders. Demand that Africa leads on its own peace, its own trade, its own defense, not relying on foreign negotiators first.
And stepping back for just a second, there's another force highlighted that's often overlooked, but the sources say is crucial.
Who's that?
African women. They're not just presented as participants, but as rising leaders, anchoring the moral compass of the One Africa vision.
Okay, give me some examples.
Well, things like women-led cooperatives driving food security and trade, especially noted in East Africa. Female ministers drafting key integration policies, climate strategies. And even in really tough spots like Somalia or Sudan, women's peace movements making tangible progress where formal politics sometimes fails. There's this great analogy used. If the One Africa government is the engine, then women are the oil, invisible to some but vital to all movement.
So, bringing it all together, what's the big takeaway here? Our sources seem to paint a pretty clear picture. This is Africa's moment, and the world is noticing. You look around. Europe's aging, America's dealing with divisions, Asia's crowded.
And Africa?
Africa is young, it's bold, it's in motion. Huge potential, demographically, economically.
The world can't really ignore it anymore.
Right, from tech hubs in Nairobi to fintech in Lagos, Africa isn't just trying to catch up. The sources suggest it's creating a new standard for development, for sovereignty.
But that resistance, the influence, attempts, they'll continue.
Oh, absolutely. The West will keep trying to influence, delay, maybe co-opt the movement. That seems inevitable.
But if you look at the long arc, the sources suggest something profound, external powers. They're not just fighting Africa anymore. They might be fighting inevitability. This idea, the One Africa government, in whatever form it takes, it feels like it's coming. So that leaves a big question for you listening right now to think about. Will the world figure out how to cooperate with this rising force? Find new ways to engage?
Or risk getting left behind as Africa charts its own path.
Yeah. The core message rings really clear. Africa is not for sale. It is for Africa. This feels like, well, the dawn of something new.